Okay.
It's a real pleasure to speak to the Orange Audubon and other people out there who might be tuning in. I'm doing it by Zoom is still a little bit funny to me, but this'll work. So tonight I'm going to be talking about the radical process that's going on to change English bird names within pretty much all of the Americas. And this I'm going to kind of go through a timeline of how this came about. And I'm going to give lots of examples of the type of names that are going to change and some of the processes. This is a super contentious issue. And I think a good alternate title for this is Opening a Can of Worms, because it's hard to find two people that agree on all aspects. And there's a lot of people, although we're all birders, we're all concerned with conservation, we all, love birds. It seems like this issue is very divisive. So I'll get in a little bit more into that in a bit. So this came about me giving this talk to you at the Orange Audubon, because I think Deborah was at the Florida Ornithological Society meetings up in Gainesville, I think it was. And we have a skin quiz that I take specimens from the museum that I work at, the Florida Museum of Natural History, and I cover up the tags so that people can guess which species they are. This is always a big hit. And sometimes I'm kind of noted for my by my tough quizzes that I give. What I did at this particular quiz, there's always a theme, and this issue about changing the bird names had been, making the rounds lately. So all the birds that I put on the quiz were birds that were eponyms, and that is, an eponym is a bird that is named after a person. So Lewis's woodpecker is named after Meriwether Lewis, famous for being part of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And a lot of these birds are named after 19th century ornithologists, mostly white men, but there's a lot of exceptions. There's kind of what was going on in science in those days was that it was mainly a male pursuit, and it was mainly white people or Western Europeans. But there was exceptions, like Grace's warbler is actually named for a woman. She is the wife of Elliott Cowes, who was one of the founders of the American Ornithological Union. And he thought, the namer of this bird thought it was good to name it after her, because for whatever reason. Okay, so let's give a brief history of, or kind of a drawn out history maybe. The main organization of ornithology in the United States, well, in the Americas, is the American Ornithological Union, the AOU. It changed its name about 10 years ago to the American Ornithological Society. It was founded in 1883 by William Brewster, Elliott Cowes, who we just mentioned, and Joel Allen, mainly for the concern of bird conservation and interest in developing the field of ornithology in North America. And it's kind of modeled a little bit after the British Ornithological Union, which started about a couple decades earlier in Britain. Here we see the greater peewee. If you've been birding long enough, you might have known this bird as Cowes flycatcher, and which is an eponym. But it was changed to greater peewee in the 1970s to conform to the usage of that name in Middle America, where most of its range is. So names are not very stable, as you can see with like Cowes flycatcher. There's a lot of changes that have been going on. So what was going on before the 1880s was there was hundreds of names for some birds. A flicker, yellow-shafted flicker had literally hundreds of common names for it. And part of the AOUs, what they wanted to do first was create a committee that was going to decide a list of not only scientific names, but English names, so that people could communicate easily about these birds. If you're just all throwing around different names, there's going to be it's going to be very difficult to communicate. And then we also have to deal with people that use these names like in a legal sense, like the Threatened and Endangered Species Act, which would come along later. So right from the get-go, there were controversies, of course. And there was controversies about eponyms. Should birds be named after people? There were a lot of names that had been used. They were already stable by the 1880s. Things like Nashville warbler, or Connecticut warbler, or ringneck duck that really don't very well describe the bird or the geography of the bird. So some people were already suggesting in the early 1900s that those names should be changed. Against that was the idea of stability and this idea that a stable nomenclature, what the birds are named, is important for people to be able to communicate. So these two kind of contrasting issues, fixing bird names or making them better versus stability were in contrast. The first edition of the AOU checklist was in 1886. So right after the AOU, the organization was started, and this was popularly known as the Checklist Committee. Here's a Kitlitz's murrelet. I'm going to have a number pretty much on every slide. There's going to be a bird that is named after a person, an eponym. And I'm going to give a little bit of biography about the person. This is named for a German artist and naval officer who went around the world collecting specimens in the early 1800s. Okay, so this kind of ingredients of stability and controversy continued all through most of the 19th century, the 19th century, and then into the 20th century. And the AOU pretty much was the America's north of Mexico, so U.S. and Canada. But in 1983, they started to expand their area that the AOU Checklist Committee was dealing with. And in 1983, they included all of Middle America, so from Mexico down to Panama and all the Caribbean. So this greatly expanded the number of bird species that the AOU was dealing with. In 1998, the South American Checklist Committee was established. This was out of Louisiana State University, where I actually did my PhD. So that started, and in 2002, it became part of the AOU. So the AOU at 2002 now had a North America Classification Committee, the NAC, NACC, and it had the SACC for South America. So it pretty much covered ornithology, the nomenclature and classification and taxonomy from Canada down to Tierra del Fuego. Around this time, I had been working on the every 15 years or so, they put out a checklist, a new edition of the checklist. And the previous secretary for that had passed away, Burt Monroe, in the mid-90s, and they needed someone to edit all the new material coming in. So my advisor, who was on the committee, Van Remsen, said, I had just finished my PhD. He goes, well, you want to help edit this? We have some money for it. And I said, sure. So I started to do that. They liked the work I did. And in 1999, they asked me to join the committee. So this is pretty cool. I was, really excited to be part of this committee that got to decide what's a species, what they're called. It was a very big honor to be part of this committee. So here is a bird. This shows kind of the reach of what the AOU was calling the birds, what their nomenclature was. This is Snethlogie's flycatcher, and it's named after a Brazilian ornithologist, Emily Snethlage, a woman, and she was instrumental in the first kind of wave of ornithology in Brazil. She's kind of been swept under the rug more recently, but there's been some expeditions that were named after her at LSU, and her name has been very much in the news lately. So hopefully she'll get some more notoriety from this. Okay, so things were going along swimmingly, and then I'm kind of giving ingredients. So we're going to start stirring in some social justice and those sort of ideas into what we did at the AOU Checklist Committee. And we work by a system of proposals. People or committee members will submit proposals. These might be to split species, to lump species, to change scientific names, to change English names. The scientific names are very, very stringent on how you change them. So they're not easily changed at all. The first one of this kind of ilk was what was called the old squaw, which is now known as a long-tailed duck. Now, squaw is a pejorative term for many, many Native Americans. It refers to female women, Native Americans, and supposedly the bird talks a lot, and it reminded these old timers of Native American women, the way that they continually chattered. So the Canadian Wildlife Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, this duck is declining rapidly, and they were putting together projects to ensure their conservation. A lot of their breeding areas are in Native American territories in Canada and the US. And it would be hard for them to go into these areas and say, oh, we want to save an old squaw, which is a pejorative term for them. So that wouldn't work very well. So they wrote a proposal to the committee and said, we should change the name. And actually, the bird was already known as the long-tailed duck in the old world. So it went through our committee and it actually passed, even though this wasn't the most stable move of all time. But I think all of us felt like conservation of the species was more important than the stability in this case. And well, pretty much probably in all cases. So we changed the name. When we published the result, and this part of the 21st century, early part, political correctness was often seen as a very negative, kind of a negative way to deal with things. So we kind of downplayed the reasons why we did this in our write-up of it, so that, we didn't push people's buttons about being politically correct. And we just said, oh, we're going to change it to long-tailed duck because that's what it's called in the old world. Okay, let's stir ahead to 2018. And we got a proposal from Robert Driver, was his name, and it was to change the English name of McCown's longspur. Now, McCown was a Confederate officer in the Confederacy. He had kind of a speckled history with the Confederacy. At first, he was, he rose through the ranks, and then he apparently didn't get along with the higher ups in the Confederacy and wrote some bad stuff about them. But then when the war was over, he actually went back to being very pro Confederacy and keep, displaying flags, and he had a little museum. He was the first one to collect McCown's longspur, what became known as McCown's longspur. And Robert Driver's proposal said that this name is not we shouldn't be honoring this person that was a willing participant against the United States and a willing participant in keeping slavery. So it would be a turnoff to, a lot of people these days. So we got the proposal. It actually didn't pass the first time because the proposal was kind of lacking in details, especially about what McCown's ornithological assets were, what he gave to ornithology. But then they refined the proposal. He actually wrote it with the secretary of the chair of our committee, and it passed then in 2020. So we're starting to see that, we're going to have to deal with some of the histories of these people. And in 2020, actually that's NACC, it should say, not the NCAA. We updated our guidelines for English bird names to include revisions for ethical behavior of their namesakes. So this is kind of a pretty big turn from the stability argument, where we should just keep the names the same if there's not, a good reason, like a taxonomic reason, to change them. Okay, so after McCown's longspur, we started in 2020 was the year of George Floyd, and there started to be a lot more push for increasing inclusion and diversity within organizations, within just society in general. There was a group of ornithologists within the AOS, and they were called Bird Names for Birds, and they put together a petition for the AOS to acknowledge that eponymous and honorific common names like McCown's longspur, to acknowledge this issue and to outline a plan to change harmful common names. This is kind of just what we had just done with McCown's longspur, and to prioritize the implementation of this plan. So I took this little paragraph right off their website. It's the second paragraph in their website, and it says eponyms, blah, 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 and honorific common bird names are problematic because they perpetuate colonialism and racism associated with it. The names that these birds currently have, for example, Bachman sparrow, represent and remember people, mainly white men, who often had objectively horrible past and do not uphold the morals and standards the bird community should memorialize. And this seemed like kind of a broad stroke to me and a lot of people, but the petition garnered 2,500 signatures that was given to the AOS. At the same time, our committee, the NACC, received a proposal that was based on taxonomy, and this was to split eastern meadowlark into the population, the subspecies that was in southeast Arizona and northern Mexico, apart from, to split it from the rest of the eastern meadowlark species. And this is built based on the biology of the species and reproductive isolation. But when you split apart the new pieces need new names. Eastern meadowlark was kept because it's like 90% of the distribution. That's kind of in our rules for English names. But the new one in North Mexico and Arizona needed a new name. It was known as Lillian's meadowlark in all the literature. And it was named after, I can't remember exactly who Lillian was. I should remember, but so we got this proposal. We agreed that it should be split, and then we had to pick, figure out an English name. Well, eponyms were not very popular by then. And also this new species included populations further south in Mexico that were never included within what was known as Lillian's meadowlark. So we went through a process that we kind of really branched out to find new names. And the main ways that we did this, one of the main ways, was to go to all the reviewers for eBird. So these are all pretty good birders. And we asked them what they preferred and gave them a number of selections. And I think Chihuahuan was one of the most popular, or the most popular. Shortgrass, no, that was never mind. So the Chihuahuan was very popular. The other things were like West Mexican, and Lillian's, of course, got some votes. But we opted to go with Chihuahuan meadowlark because that describes the distribution the best, and it seemed like the most fitting name for this new species. Okay, the AOS at this time, they've received this petition, And so they decided that we needed to do something about the situation with English bird names. And so they formed an ad hoc committee, this English Bird Names Committee, with the following charge: to develop a process that would allow the AOS to change harmful and exclusionary English bird names in a thoughtful and proactive way for species within the purview of the AOS, the purview being everything in the Americas from Alaska down to Tierra del Fuego. As part of this, naming this committee, they had a community forum that had people like Ken Kaufman and David Sibley, people from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, people from Cornell. There was one person from our North American Checklist Committee, and a few other kind of noteworthy names. This forum, though, was pretty heavily in favor of removing eponymous names in total. And so it was more like an echo chamber, in my view, than actually useful discussion about it. One of the names, excuse me. So one of the names that is probably most problematic is Scott's Oriole. After we removed McCown's longspur, the next one probably on the chopping block would be Scott's Oriole. This is named for Winfield Scott. He was commander of the U.S. Army during the Mexican-American War, but also really involved in the forceful removal of Native Americans from their native territories and into Indian territories like Oklahoma and such. And it was pretty much, genocide. And Scott was very much pro removal of these people. He was the commander of the person that described Scott's Oriole. And for some reason, the person who described it thought that Scott should be memorialized with this name. So this is kind of person that our committee would probably have changed. But by this time, we had a moratorium on changing bird names until we let this the EBNC figure things out and how we were what kind of process we were going to use to change English bird names. So in 2023, the EBNC made their recommendations, and it was kind of startling. They said, we do not want to make these judgments about people's character. They said it's too slippery. It's too subjective. Let's just remove all the eponymous names. And so this would rid of the 2,000 or so, 2,100 species in the AOS area from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. About 5% of the names were eponymous. So it's not a huge number, but it's also pretty significant. And a lot of birds that birders know would have their names changed. So what the AOS Council then did is they needed to make a decision about the recommendations of this ad hoc committee. In October, they requested letters from members of the North American and South American Checklist Committee. In our letters, there's 16 members that responded. 15 of the 16 of these two committees recommended to the council that they not adopt the EBNC recommendations. And what we instead wanted to do was look at these names on a case-by-case basis and get rid of the most egregious examples, the ones that really stuck out. And instead of sweeping all ornithologists under the rug. So here's Parker's spinetail. I think most of you have heard of Ted Parker. He was instrumental he's probably the best field biologist of the 20th century. He died tragically in a plane accident in Ecuador. He has a spinetail, a bird, a Fernaria named after him in South America. And so this would be under what the AOS would consider a name that would need to be changed, even though Ted Parker is remembered fondly and, by almost everybody that knew him. Okay, so on November 1st, soon after they got all these letters from us, they released their 3 important commitments to the English names of birds. The first was to change all English names of birds named after people within its geographical purview. So again, Alaska to Terra del Fuego, named after people. And I said like 5% of this almost 2,200 species, along with other names they deemed offensive or exclusionary, like old squaw or something like Inca dove, which is a Mexican bird that's never even been anywhere near an Incan person. And they said to focus first on those species that occur primarily within the US or Canada. The second point was to establish a new committee to oversee the assignment of English names, so take it out of the NACC's and SACC's hands. And third, although they might be involved in that committee. And third, to actively involve the public in the process of selecting new bird names. And like I said, this was something that the NACC had started to do with the naming the meadowlark. And it's something that the SACC had done, the South American Committee had done for almost 15 years already. So this was, this is just part of being transparent. I agree wholeheartedly with involving the public in this process. Here's Zeledon's antbird, a bird that's restricted to Costa Rica and Panama, I think. It's named after Jose Castulo Zeledon. And he is kind of the hero of Costa Rican ornithology. Actually, the Journal of Costa Rican Ornithology is named Zeledonia after the wren thrush, which the genus of that is Zeledonia, which is, of course, named after Zeledon. So we've mixed in the social justice, and we've the AOS had really gone ahead with kind of one of the most extreme courses that they could plot. One of the first things that happened was that in December, the SACC, led by Van Remsen at LSU, and all of its members left the AOS. So what they did was they joined the International Ornithological Congress, the IOC, which already had a nomenclature group, a worldwide nomenclature group, and they were just going to be the South American experts for that committee, for that organization. And so one of the first things that happened was the AOS lost kind of control of nomenclature for all of South America. Immediately after this, the AOS published these recommendations, the Washington Post wrote some articles about it. Washington Post is a left-leaning newspaper. They allow comments to their articles from subscribers, and they did some nice analysis. Kevin Winker did some nice analysis of these, and some of them, one of the articles had like 2.7 to 1 comments against the changes, and the other one was more like 3.8 to 1 against the changes. In 2024, then, there was enough kind of reaction from people to form a counter petition. And this eventually grew to 6,500 signatures, so more than twice as much as the original Bird Names for Birds petition. And the main point of this petition was to scrap the total purge of eponymous bird names and do it on a case-by-case basis. So one of the eponyms is Bishop's o'o, which is a Hawaiian bird that's now extinct. It's named after Charles Reed Bishop, that's who the main museum in Hawaii is named after. He was actually married to the queen, I can't remember her name, but she was the last descendant of the royal lineage, of the Kamehameha lineage of Hawaiian monarchs. And so he was very involved in Hawaiian politics as it was becoming more and more involved with the US government. Okay, so in 2024, that's this year, of course, There was also a petition put together by the AOS fellows. The AOS has divisions. There are elected members, there's regular members, there's fellows, and the fellows are the old time, or not just old time, but the most noted ornithologists. There's about over 500 of them. A lot of them weren't very happy with this general purge of all eponyms. 231 of them signed a petition to the council, AOS council, to put a moratorium on changing bird names and figure out kind of a new process. Interestingly, Utah passed a law to prevent bird name changes. They look at this as kind of a woke, kind of in the DeSantis type of philosophy, I guess. But it kind of shows, although there's probably very little I agree with that comes out of the Utah legislature, it's interesting that they would, kind of be on the same page as some things that I would say. There's a website called Bird Forum, which is mainly British, but it's got a lot of Americans. There's a taxonomy section. It's a huge, I think it's the most popular birding website. It just isn't as popular in the US as it is in the rest of the world. Out of 350 votes in their poll, 60 were against the AOS purge of eponyms. And then recently, the Association of Field Ornithologists sent their members a poll to see what their response was. I haven't heard the results of that yet. It's interesting that one of the first things when the AOS was forming the committee, the ad hoc committee, one of their recommendations was to do a poll of members. Do a poll of fellows or do a poll of all members, do a general poll. They didn't do any of those. They kind of got the recommendations from the committee and the council. The only opinions they asked were from the checklist committees, and those were almost unanimously opposed to it, but they still went ahead with it. This is Nuttall's woodpecker here. Nuttall was started the first ornithology organization in the United States, and he actually published a small field guide, really the first one. He wrote Manual of Ornithology. He was very critical kind of at that juncture of when kind of organized ornithology was starting in the United States. Okay, so the AOS recently responded to the petition, and they've somewhat scaled back the purge, mainly by geography. They recognized that the SACC, the South American Committee, had left the AOS. They didn't lay any plans to replace them. They just kind of acknowledged that they had left. They also said, we're not going to really deal with British birds that are vagrants in the United States, old world birds like Pallas's wood warbler, or there's lots of old world birds that have these that are eponyms. They announced a pilot project to start on this name changes, though still they want to go ahead with the name changing, at least for North American birds that are residents here. And the species they chose to start with are Inca dove, like I mentioned. The Inca dove is a Mexican US species that doesn't occur anywhere near the Inca Empire, which was mainly in totally in South America. And then two birds named after John Kirk Townsend. Townsend's been beat up in the press recently. He was fundamental in describing birds in the Western US. Audubon never made it west of the Mississippi, I think, and kind of Townsend was the one who was collecting birds and describing new birds from the Western United States. He was sent out kind of as, he didn't really have a job. He just kind of was hired by, I think, Smithsonian and given small wages to go out and collect birds. And one of the Smithsonian curators at the time was working on a project to show that white people were superior. And one of the things that he thought showed this was the size of their skulls. So he paid Townsend to bring back skulls, and which he got from Native American graveyards. And so this has really tarred Townsend's reputation. There was a very nice biography of him written by Sartor Williams, ornithologist from New Mexico. I think it was in 2008 in the AOS. That doesn't really mention this, but it does go over his contributions to ornithology. Scott's Oriole is another one. That bird is named after Winfield Scott, like I mentioned. Maui parrotbill is an interesting case. It was there was no a lot of Hawaiian birds have native names, but the Maui parrotbill didn't. And the Hawaiian biologists came together and came up with a native Hawaiian name for it, kind of coined a new name. And they made a proposal to the AOS, but in the name of stability, we decided to keep Maui parrotbill, but that was probably a wrong move. We should really have, since so many birds in Hawaii are named after have Hawaiian names, it wouldn't have been bad to change to Maui parrotbill. And Bachman was an old-time ornithologist. He was a reverend. He had an interesting past. He did write some negative things about African Americans. He also wrote some very positive things. He was one of the few people in the Carolinas that allowed African Americans in his congregation to sit freely with them while he was giving his services. So as we can see that to this day, the AOS has been hampered in their influence in ornithology, especially in South America. Whereas before we could decide, the AOS was deciding what the species limits were, what we're going to call them. And now the AOS has lost that ability because the committee left to go to another organization. And some of the names, another one of the names that would be lost in this shuffling would be Goonlock's hawk. And I don't know if you guys are birders, you probably heard about the Goonlock's hawk that showed up in Fort Myers right after Hurricane Irma, I think it was. It was about 3 months after Irma. This bird showed up on New Year's Day on the roof of Fort Myers. They got these pictures. It is certainly looks like a good Goonlock's hawk, and it's the only North American record. Goonlock is looked really fondly in the Caribbean. He's called the father of natural sciences in Puerto Rico, where he lived, but he's mainly known for his work in Cuba. The Cuban ornithologists think he's kind of, their hero, their Audubon or their Alexander Wilson of that country's ornithological traditions. So what I'm going to do now is I had put together this initially, as I said, for the skin quiz of the FOS. And I just made short biographies of some of the eponyms. And I'm just going to go through these rather quickly. They're very short. They didn't really dwell on the negative aspects of these people. If you want to read about the negative aspects, you could go to the Bird Names for Birds website, and they have pretty exhaustive, at least in the negative sense, biographies of each of the birds that are eponyms. They're very biased, in my opinion. They really don't talk about contributions to ornithology. They don't put the actions of these people in their perspective of when at the time they were living. Things were different, in the 1800s for these people. Some of their actions were inexcusable still, and so somewhere there's a line that should be drawn, in my opinion. But we don't need to throw all the good out with the bad. So Corey Shearwater was an ornithologist that worked at the Field Museum. He described a new subspecies of shearwater in 1881, which was later named for him. It's interesting, our checklist committee has recently voted on splitting hoary shearwater from Scopely shearwater, and a little bit of it looks like this is going to pass. So this is going to be split. Hoaries is still going to be the name for the borealis, the widespread one, and the one that breeds in the Mediterranean, Scopely, is going to be called Scopely shearwater. Blackburnian warbler doesn't really sound like a name, but is actually named after a person. Anna Blackburn was an English museum patron. She paid for, supported the museum natural history work in Britain. Her brother collected the Blackburnian warbler, and it was named after her. It's I like this female shot of the female. The male is so gaudy that it kind of hogs all the pictures, but the females are also quite nice. Steller's jay, one of my favorite birds. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. This is one of the birds in my backyard that got me hooked on birding. Steller, there's a great biography written about him. He was in the early 18th century. He went on Bering's expedition to Siberia. He was a German naturalist. There was a couple other birds, and also the Steller sea cow was named after him. He was kind of a light of optimism and sanity. Bering was crazy, and the biography is just amazing how Steller kind of got by with this crazy captain. Clark's nutcracker is named after William Clark, the Meriwether Lewis companion on the Lewis and Clark expeditions. Clark had called it a bird of the woodpecker kind, so maybe he wasn't a leading ornithologist. And then Wilson described it as Clark's crow. Bonaparte's gull, you may wonder where this name came from. Charles Lucien Bonaparte, he's kind of known as the father of systematic ornithology, putting kind of the scientific names and genera of birds together for North America. And he published it as American Ornithology, or a history of the birds inhabiting the United States, not given by Wilson. That is Alexander Wilson, the father of American ornithology. And he's actually the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. Wilson's follower-up, I just mentioned Alexander Wilson, known as the father of American ornithology. He was slightly earlier than Audubon. They existed at the same time. He put together this 9-volume American Ornithology, which was the leading reference for American birds, but not for long, because Audubon published his not too long afterwards, and Audubon's work was just a million times more amazing in all ways. I mean, Audubon was an incredible illustrator, and Wilson, though, really started the whole ornithological tradition in North America, at least from the Western European perspective. Say's phoebe is named after Thomas Say. He's an English naturalist, I think, and he was on the expedition to the Rocky Mountains in 1819 and 20. Actually, the whole genus of phoebes, both all the Says, eastern and black phoebes, or the genus is Sayornis, named after him. Bewick's wren was named by Audubon. He was an English author and engraver. When Audubon was putting together his Birds of the Americas, he went to England, where he's trying to get support for it and get people to do the engraving. And I think Bewick was instrumental in helping Audubon get his works together. Bullock's Oriole was named after William Bullock. He was an English traveler, mine owner, proprietor of a museum. He went to New Mexico, collected a bunch of new birds, and some of them were named by Swainson, which we'll get to later. This is actually an Oriole in my backyard a couple of winters ago, a Bullock's Oriole, which is a rare bird in Florida. Montezuma quail, they're not all named after white men. Montezuma was the Aztec emperor, as you probably know. It sounds like he wasn't the most moral man of all time, kind of known for all sorts of human sacrifices and stuff like this. But still, it's an evocative name for sure. Cooper's hawk was named for William Cooper. He's one of the founders of the New York Lyceum of Natural History. Cooper described even in grosbeak, and Bonaparte named this hawk for him. Brewer's blackbird, named for Thomas Brewer. He championed the house sparrow introduction to the U.S., so kind of boo on that. But he was publisher and editor of American Ornithology. Ornithology is a study of bird eggs, which was super popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Swainson is a monumental person in North American ornithology, although I don't think he ever came here. He was a noted naturalist and author, and Audubon really was, it was important for him to get Swainson's thumbs up for his work. He later became Attorney General in New Zealand, actually. Lincoln sparrow is not named for Abraham, but for Thomas Lincoln. He accompanied Audubon on an expedition to Labrador and found the sparrow, which Audubon named for him. Townsend, already mentioned, described new species and sent them to Audubon. So you can see in these are in somewhat mostly chronological order, that Audubon was instrumental in this period from about 1830 to about 1850. A lot of what was going on with bird names and describing new species was happening either through Audubon or by Audubon himself. William McGilvray was a Scottish ornithologist, and he was the first created the first taxonomy based on anatomy, which is interesting. He also proofed Audubon's work. Audubon Shearwater is, of course, named for John James Audubon. He has a checkered past somewhat. There's been lots of biographies written about him. A couple of them have shown some negative aspects. He wrote letters to England, to his relatives, or in France maybe, that were pretty racist. And he owned, during the period that he lived in Louisiana, I think, some slaves himself, maybe one or two. And he's super famous. And I think if you think about birds in North America, the first name that pops up, of course, is Audubon. Edward Harris, Harris's sparrow and Harris's hawk, was Audubon's companion on a Missouri trip, and he described him as one of the best friends I have in the world. So if you're a friend of Audubon, you're probably in line to get a bird named after you. Gamble's quail, he was the first ornithologist, William Gamble, to collect birds in California. Sprague's pipit, also described by Audubon. He was an artist, and he, again, another person that accompanied Audubon on his Missouri River trip, and he collected the type specimen. LeConte sparrow, described by Audubon, he was an entomologist mainly with interest in birds, and he was president of the American Association for Advancement of Science, still a major organization of science in the U.S. Bell's vireo, he was a New York taxonomist. I took this picture because this is the southwestern subspecies least-belled vireo, which doesn't look anything like the ones we see here in the east. He collected the type, and Casson named the species for him. Lewis's woodpecker I mentioned already. The spectacular woodpecker is named for Meriwether Lewis. Abert's towhee, James William Abert was an Army officer, collected birds in the Southwest U.S., including this towhee, which Spencer Fullerton Baird named for him. Williamson sapsucker, one of my favorite birds, Williamson was a U.S. Army lieutenant and leader of surveys, railroad surveys. It's interesting, Newberry, this guy, collected males and named them after Williamson, but Casson collected very different females 6 years earlier and had given them the name Thyroideus. So that scientific name is priority, but Williamson was kept for the English name. So Casson's finch is named after John Casson. He was curator of ornithology at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, and is probably the most prolific describer of taxa of birds in North America, described 193 species and subspecies. And Spencer Fullerton Baird was the first secretary of the Smithsonian Institute. He was an American ornithologist. He was super influential, kind of in this time when the AOU was forming, and a lot of these later species were being described in the later 1800s after Wilson and Audubon had moved on. Grace's warbler was named after Grace Cowes, the wife of Eliot Cowes, or no, the brother of, the type was collected by Eliot Cowes, and she is the sister, and then Spencer Baird named it after Eliot Cowes' sister. And Bendire's thrasher, one of the later described species in the U.S., he was curator of oology and study of eggs at the Smithsonian, author of a life history of North American birds, and he collected type, and Cowes named it after him. And lastly, there's Ainley's storm petrel, and this is named by Steve Howell for David Ainley, a marine ecologist who described this taxon. It was described as a subspecies of Leach's storm petrel, and when Steve noted differences in some in the timing of breeding and some of the vocalizations, and that Ainley had done. And so he, in Steve's book, he gave it an English name, which it hadn't had, and he named it for David Ainley. And Ainley also later showed that, through this work, that it was a separate species from leeches. Interesting thing about Ainley's storm petrel is that it is the only North American bird named after a person who's still alive. Okay, so that's it for bird names. I hope we can get the worms back in the can. I know this is a very divisive issue, and I kind of hate to see what it's done to ornithology and the kind of people have chosen size. It's very divisive. There's been some name calling, which is really unfortunate. I think we need to keep the conversation civil, and we need to figure out a way to kind of get back past the division. We're all in favor of bird conservation, and I think promoting ornithology for all people. It's important. It's so important to do this, and I think that we're being divided on an issue that is not in the best interest of the birds. We want to conserve birds, and we need a way to get through this so that we can concentrate on more important topics. Okay.
All right. Any questions?
Thank you. That was really interesting.
Yeah, it's a very difficult subject to talk about, actually, and just because it stirs up people's emotions.
Now, I noticed a couple of them. One of them, you said they gave the name, and I think he was looking for like an engraver. So were there some of these seem to be given to curry favor with other people? Do you think that is why some of these were named?
I don't quite understand your question.
Oh, okay. I don't know if there's any history, but you had mentioned one was named after an engraver and that he was trying to find an engraver. Do you think this is like a way to kind of,
a tit for tat,
favor or tit for tat? Do this.
If you look at some of the controversies about eponyms, I think some of that was probably going on. Is to get people, are vain and want things named after them, of course. So we had, not just birds, we name things after people all the time. So, cities, parks, continents, theories in physics, all of these are eponyms. And in this period of intense bird naming in the late 1800s or mid 1800s, I can see that maybe there was some of that going on.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't look good, I think, for the eponym argument.
For Michelle Reyes had mentioned, as names are chosen, will they be released a few at a time or all at once?
No, it's definitely going to be a few at a time. So that this pilot project with the 6 species is to kind of work out the process. They don't even have the committee yet that's going to decide the names. But what they want to start engaging the public, which is great. They want to, come to a name that's going to be agreeable. And the first ones they chose were, some of the people that were probably behavior-wise the most egregious. So they're not going to have a lot of supporters.
So Pete Johnson wanted to know, who was Bachman again? Can you review who he was?
He was a minister at a church and a naturalist I think in Charleston. There's a couple biographies written about him. And this is before Audubon, I think, or maybe a little, or right at the early time of Audubon. And he had some bad ideas or some racist ideas about African Americans, but he also treated them equally in some respects to white Americans by having them be part of his congregation, which was pretty unusual, I think, in that day and age in the South.
Tanya had mentioned, she just said, thanks for sharing your insights. And Martha says, I guess this is about to be a done deal.
It's kind of hard to say. I mean, the AOS is still acting like it's a done deal, but they did respond somewhat to the petition. It'll be interesting to see what's going on because, they're going to have new counselors, new presidents as time goes on. And I don't know if everybody's going to be as jump on this bandwagon for a total purge of eponymous names. So it remains to be seen. Stay tuned. It's going to be an interesting time. And I don't see a way out of the divisiveness for now, but hopefully we will. Some people, our young people will figure out a way to make this a more palatable process.
And Delcy said, thank you for your presentation.
Well, thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
And Pam, oops, wait, a couple of them came in at once. Ethan said, since control has been lost over South American bird names, I assume they will not be changed.
Yes, as long as, the SACC is not going to change them. And so the worldwide committees that you keep track of, like Clements and there's a couple of different groups, HBW and stuff, that keep track of global bird names. They're going to follow the SACC. What if if AOS puts together a South American committee, maybe that might change. But right now, I think that the SACC is going to stick with the IOC, and they're not going to be changing eponyms unless they're people that in that committee are the same as the NACC. If they find that the people are objectionable, they will change the name. They're not, they're not in for stability at all costs. They want to, they're just as much for an inclusive organization to in ornithology.
And Pam says, we've survived name changes before. American to great, Louisiana to try, it will be fine.
Yeah, that's true. That's one of the comments that's been made. But there's never been a name change of this order. Actually, English names they've only been changed mainly. There's been some names like Great Egret and Tricolored Heron that were changed to kind of match usage in other parts of the world, especially Great Egret. Tricolored Heron is one of the ones that was just changed kind of willy-nilly. But it's interesting that English names have been more stable actually than scientific names, and much more stable in the past 50 years, because scientific names, DNA has kind of uprooted all the taxonomy. And so what we, used to consider a genus is now very different than we did before. So the generic names have changed, whereas the scientific names have stayed the same. If you look at especially the warblers, almost all the warblers are in different genera than they were 20 years ago even. And now, but their English names are all the same. So, yeah, we can adapt, but it's going to be, I think it's, the more names you change, the more difficult it's going to become. And the whole process of changing the name is very, very, it's complex. Hopefully the new committee will be able to work it out so it's not so pulling your hair out. But it's been difficult for our committee when we were changing names, deciding new names for splits and things like that. It was often the most difficult part was coming up with an appropriate English name. And I don't think it's going to be different, to tell you the truth.
Vicky said, how will birders communicate and talk about birds if organizations have different names?
That's true. Yeah, one of the things that there's a group that's the AOS, the NACC and the SACC and the Clements and the IOC have all kind of got together, and it's called WIGAC, there's something about world names, and they're trying to get a taxonomy for all of the birds in the world, so that there wouldn't be, what we call green-winged teal. We consider it the same species as common teal in the old world. A lot of people don't. So they would kind of settle questions like this, where there's disagreements, and also disagreements with English names. But eBird does it by, you can actually click on different usages. So you can have your list kind of in British English through eBird through a click, or you can use the American bird names. So your Z's would become S's in British, and you would have, the OUR for color, things like that. Gray with an E instead of an A. Diver instead of loon. So go ahead.
Sorry. Oh, I was going to continue on, but yeah. Martha said, how can field guides be updated by just a few birds each year?
Well, it'll keep the field guide authors busy. And
there's also always pens, right?
Yeah. I think that actually, two of the leading field guide authors, David Sibley and Ken Coffman, were both in favor of this, but also they're probably going to sell more books once I hate to accuse them of that. I don't think that's their reasoning, but it does work out that way. If all the bird names change, people are going to want new books that have the right names.
And do you think print field guides will issue new editions with the name changes?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. National Geographic is coming out with a new edition, which is kind of a big change from their older editions. And they're coming out with it this year before the change. So so much is online these days that it's, that it's a lot easier to change online stuff than it is to change print. So
any other questions?
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'd be glad to answer questions by email if you have anything. So is my slide still up?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. So there's my email at the bottom here. And yeah, feel free to send any comments or whatever you want. It's been great talking with you all, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
All right.
It was a great present, very interesting. And thank you everyone for joining us.